What's happening, Packer fans? Happy Saturday. Welcome into the Pack a Day podcast. I'm your host, Andy Herman. You can follow me on Twitter at Andy Herman NFL. You can follow the podcast at Pack a Day Podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Today, I want to go through an injury report, and I want to go through the injuries that are going to affect Green Bay this weekend, but I also want to take a look and fast forward ahead a little bit to the potential playoffs and what the roster potentially looks like based on the injuries we know right now. So I'll get to that in just a moment. But obviously, in the more near future, we're looking at the injuries that are going to affect the Packers this Sunday against the Rams in a really key NFC matchup that will certainly affect the NFC seeding through the remainder of this season and going into the playoffs. So let's start with the players that are officially ruled out in this game. One is David Bakhtiari, obviously, and clearly that is not a surprise. Malik Taylor also is listed as out for this game. So down a receiver in that regards. Certainly not a huge loss, but he is their primary kick returner, and he is actually a pretty decent blocker as well. But overall, I think that's certainly, a situation. I mean, look, last week all the kicks went through the end zone anyway. I don't think Rodgers even touched the ball as a kick returner, and we'll see if that's the same at Lambeau Field, but probably not a huge difference there, and certainly something that Green Bay has the ability to overcome. Doubtful is Kevin King. Now, I know that there's going to be a subsection of Packer fans that will rejoice and say, good, Kevin King, he's out, we don't need him, etc., etc. And I do believe that, and as I mentioned yesterday, Rasul Douglas, to me, should be the player starting in that spot at this point. This should be Stokes, this should be Douglas, and this should be Sullivan as your top three. What I do want to reiterate, though, is even if you're not very high on the Kevin King bandwagon, which I think is fair at this time, I do still think he has certainly value as depth. Now, we can go into all the conversation we want as to whether or not Kevin King should be on this team and the contract that he was given in this offseason and things like that. That is certainly a different discussion that we can have. But Kevin King is on this team and did get the contract that he had. So at this point, if you had to ask me who I would rather have on the field as a number 4 cornerback in this game, if it came to that situation, if somebody got hurt, would I rather have Kevin King? Would I rather have Isaac Yiadom, or would I rather have Shamar Jean-Charles? I would much, much, much rather have Kevin King than either of those two players. And I know he's made some mistakes. I know he's inconsistent. And no, I don't think he should be in the top 5 corner. 5, right? So Jair, Stokes, Douglas, Sullivan, and then I guess then at that point you would start to look at Kevin King as the 5th guy, but I don't think you should be in the top 4 of corners on this roster, right? So that's where I'm at with it right now, but I still think he has value to this team, and you would still like to see him suited up and helping if possible. Should he be starting? No, but again, would I rather have him out there than Yiadom or Shamar Jean-Charles? I certainly would. So certainly still a loss in some capacity, but isn't going to affect special teams. And if everyone stays healthy, you probably get Douglas and Stokes on the outside, which to me is an upgrade over Kevin King in both of those spots. So not something that Green Bay is going to have to massively overcome, but still a player that likely will be lost for this game. Questionable, I'm going to split up into 2 different categories as I usually do. There's questionable players who did not practice at all. There's questionable players who were limited in practice, and there's questionable players who practiced in full. Green Bay didn't have any questionable players who didn't practice at all. So that's a good sign. Usually those players are closer to doubtful than questionable. Aaron Jones and Allen Lazard were both limited in practice and listed as questionable. To me, those are more 50-50 coin flips. Wouldn't shock me if either of them, if they gave them an extra week to rest with the bye week coming up. But if they're ready to go, they're ready to go. Certainly Lazard would help the passing offense. Certainly Aaron Jones would help all aspects of the offense, as would Allen Lazard, because he's such a good blocker as well. So, if they're ready to go, fantastic. But both of those players would not shock me if they gave them the extra week and gave them a little bit of extra rest. Although I will say Aaron Jones practiced all week. So I do think he is closer to returning than potentially Lazard is. And based on that initial injury, when you saw Jones go down, you certainly feared the worst. Even when you heard an MCL, you knew all right, that's going to be 3-4 weeks. If he makes it back and just misses 1 game, pretty incredible recovery from Aaron Jones. Even if he makes it back after the bye fully healthy, great sign for him. And the fact, again, that he's not lost for any significant period of time based on the initial just optics of that injury. Huge win for Green Bay. You then had one player who was questionable but practiced in full, and that was Rashawn Gary. Now, again, with his arm being the way that it is, I think the biggest question that's going to have to be answered for Matt LaFleur heading up to this game is there re-injury risk, or is there a risk that this could get worse by playing, and does that get better by taking a couple weeks off? If the answer is no, it is what it is. He's not going to get any, there's no further injury risk, or, things like that. Then to me, he's probably going to play, right? He practiced in full. He's going to have some sort of brace, but especially with Jonathan Garvin on the COVID list and Merciless out, Z out, they're just not in a great spot at edge rusher. And if he can provide anything, even if it's 15, 20 snaps as a situational pass rusher, I think you certainly have to look at what he can bring to this team. So we'll see. We'll see just how much he can give Green Bay if he is active, but the fact that he participated in full is certainly a good sign. And then last but not least is Aaron Rodgers, of course. He still has his toe injury. Of course, that's not going anywhere anytime fast. We did get a great Billy Turner moment where he put his foot in toe. I guess a great moment is a stretch there to say the least, but had another toe on the podium moment, if you will. And he put his foot up there and was certainly not afraid to show his. So this is, once again, an insane, crazy season, and anything that can and will happen in press conferences and in games and everything else has and will continue to happen, I'm sure. But speaking of Rodgers, he did not practice again. So this is definitely a continued issue where Rodgers just isn't able to practice with the team, which really just kind of makes, everything disjointed when Rodgers isn't out there, and it just changes everything, right? And of course, we've seen Rodgers get off to some slow starts these past couple weeks. Tough to say how much is correlated there, but I forget if it was a press conference. I think it was on McAfee, but could have been either. Where Rodgers talked about how it really does help him get into the rhythm, calling the plays, things like that. And I'm sure he does some of that and simulates some of that on the side, but it's definitely an issue. And when players can't practice, it definitely affects their game. Of all players to not practice, you could look at this two ways, right? In one way, I have less fear of Rodgers not practicing. Like, if he didn't play for 3 months and all of a sudden he went out and played tomorrow, I would still expect him to go out and have a good game. He's just that good, and he's just that, knowledgeable, and he's just that much of a veteran where he can go out and have a good game pretty much any day of the week without much practice or anything else. It's just the way his DNA is built. But on the flip side, you could also make the argument of any player to not practice. Rodgers is one of the worst because, again, as the receivers are getting ready, as the offensive line's getting ready, as your center's getting ready, is all of that, it just is affected by the fact that the quarterback that you're going to be playing with on Sunday isn't there to help you prepare, and it just is a totally different game with Jordan Love in practice, even if he's simulating how the game would be called for Aaron Rodgers. So that stuff definitely matters. It's not nothing. And while I think it's something that Green Bay can absolutely overcome, and Rodgers can certainly overcome, it definitely is still a talking point and something that Green Bay is going to have to overcome with the fact that Rodgers has no practice availability right now. And hopefully after the bye, that's something that maybe he can get a little bit more with. And I'm sure he's probably going to go through the walkthrough on Saturday, which will help as well. But right now, that remains an issue. And again, Rodgers not being able to practice definitely affects this team. Now, as I mentioned, I want to go over, because I think if we're looking at things right now, even though Rashawn Gary and Aaron Jones and some of these players might come back this week, I feel like it still feels sort of dire with all the all-pros that you're looking at. No Bakhtiari, no Elton Jenkins, no Zadarius Smith, no Jair Alexander. Rashawn Gary's beat up. Aaron Rodgers has the toe. Aaron Jones may or may not play. These are not your just run-of-the-mill, back of the roster guys where you can just pull up a guy from the practice squad and be like, all right, we're pretty much apples to apples here, no big, drop off. These are your key franchise players, the players that Green Bay specifically needs, not only to play, but to play well if they want to have a chance at a Super Bowl. But what I want to go over today is, while it seems dire and while it seems frustrating at the moment, if you look at what this roster could, and I want to emphasize could, we don't know what some of these injuries are going to end up being, and certainly there will likely still be injuries to come in the remainder of the season, but what this roster could look like come playoff time. Obviously, you would still have Aaron Rodgers at quarterback, hopefully more recovered from his toe than what he is right now. Aaron Jones and A.J. Dillon at running back would certainly still be a phenomenal 1-2 combo. I'm not going to go through the full 53-man roster here. Obviously, there's going to be back-end guys to some of this, but just to kind of show you who the key contributors would be, you have your H-back/fullback in Dominique Dafney, your wide receiver core, which would consist primarily of Devontae Adams, MVS, Randall Cobb, Allen Lazard, maybe a little bit of EQ sprinkled in if he can repeat his performance against Minnesota this past week where he was phenomenal. Tight end, certainly missing Tunyon still, but Mercedes Lewis and Josiah DeGuara. DeGuara looked really good against Minnesota. We know what Mercedes Lewis is going to bring. You still get Dominique Daphne kind of playing some of that H-back tight end, fullback role as well. So I still think more than capable at that position. David Bakhtiari at left tackle, John Runyon at left guard, Josh Myers potentially, hopefully at center, either Lucas Patrick or Royce Newman at right guard, and then Billy Turner at right tackle. That looks like a much better, much more solidified offensive line with Bakhtiari and Myers in it than it does certainly right now. At edge, you could theoretically have Zadarius Smith, Preston Smith, and Rashawn Gary. Imagine if they're able to get all three of those guys healthy and playing well at the right time. You have a defensive line that right now the rotation of Kenny Clark, Dean Lowry, Kingsley Keke, Tyler Lancaster, and TJ Slayton is playing really darn good football. They're not allowing much in the run game. They're filling gaps. They're eating double teams, and they're allowing Devondre Campbell and those linebackers to make plays. Speaking of which, you would still have Devondre Campbell and Chris Barnes at linebacker, Jair Alexander, Eric Stokes, Chandon Sullivan, Rasul Douglas, Kevin King as your corners. You'd have Darnell Savage, Adrian Amos at safety. You would have the vast majority of this team. And yes, you'd still be missing Elton Jenkins. And yes, you'd still be missing some Kylan Hills and some Whitney Mercilesses and some Robert Tunyons. It's not totally ideal, but if you could get to that point, where Jair and Z and Bakhtiari and Myers and those, Rashawn Gary and so on and so forth, those guys come back, this team looks phenomenal on paper. So while, again, it seems a little bit iffy and scotch tapey right now and band-aidy right now, there's a light at the end of this tunnel potentially. Now, even if like a Zadarius Smith seems like the one that there's maybe the least confidence in, right? That of him returning, even still, I think you still feel okay about Rashawn Gary and Preston Smith and Kenny Clark up front, the way that those three have been playing, if those three can all be healthy. So Green Bay has to find a way to avoid further injuries to key players the remainder of the season. And your hope, your fingers crossed, your lucky rabbit's foot, you're knocking on wood, everything else is that they've suffered their key injuries already, that they're going to hopefully get through the remainder of the season, especially if they can get through their bye week and this week, that maybe they're going to be able to get some rest and relaxation and some re-energy and recuperation and everything else and hit the ground running for the final stretch of the season. That would be huge. If they suffer more injuries or if some of these guys can't come back, then things start looking dire again. But as of right now, as frustrating and as, semi-dire as it looks right now, there's still a lot of light at the end of this with which players could be coming back to help this team. And oh, by the way, this team has navigated a injury-plagued, injury-filled season to go 8-3 up to this point. The losses, a Saints game, which is basically a complete throwaway, which to me was their last preseason game. I don't put any stock into that game. A Chiefs game where they didn't have Aaron Rodgers, where if they did, in my opinion, 1,000,000% they win that game. And then this past week, this Vikings game, give credit to the Vikings. They won. If they play that game 90 times out of 100 with the same circumstances, the same pass rush, the Packers offense playing the way that it did, Cousins throwing YOLO balls, Green Bay wins that game 90 times out of 100. Dead serious. That it wasn't that far off. I think when Green Bay goes back and looks at that tape, they're going to be disappointed they didn't take advantage of some of those opportunities. No question. There's going to be a lot of learning points from that game that Green Bay is going to be taking away. I don't think there's 1 iota that Green Bay's coaches are looking at that tape and saying, yeah, Minnesota was just the better team. It just was not the case at all. Minnesota played well. No two ways about it. You even argue maybe they deserve that win, maybe. But the way that Kirk Cousins was throwing, begging Green Bay to take the ball from him, the fumble, the interceptions, the potential interceptions, everything else, I think Green Bay would have loved that opportunity if they could redo that game over and over and over. They're going to win that game a lot of times. The last thing I want to go over really, really quick, I mentioned the potential lineup. I think one of the things that has to get sorted out a little bit is who plays where in the secondary. Jair is going to be one. I think Chandon's going to stay in the slot. I think he's just been good enough to stick there where maybe you don't mess things up that much there. So then do you have Stokes? Do you have Douglas? Do you have King? Who's on your other outside? I would like to see Eric Stokes opposite Jair Alexander with Sullivan in the slot. I'd like to see Amos and Savage stay at safety, obviously, but I'd like to see Rasul Douglas take that Henry Black role. And in my opinion, Douglas is by far a good enough tackler to play that role. To me, he is a great communicator, which helps in that role. And he's much better in coverage than Henry Black. Maybe if you have a situation where you get matched up with a Justin Jefferson in space, I certainly like Rasul Douglas's chances a million times better than I like Henry Black. So you might say, well, Andy, Henry Black's a bigger, more physical player. He can't maybe play that hybrid safety role. Well, Henry Black, at least according to Packers.com, 6'2", 204. Rasul Douglas, 6'2", 209. He's got 2 inches and 5 pounds on Henry Black. So I would really like to see that potential change come to fruition. Now, it's basically predicated on Jair coming back and being healthy, but I think that's the hope that at some point that he will. And he was out at practice on Friday doing some ladder drills and seemed to look good. Of course, it's his shoulder, and ladder drills don't affect or aren't affected by his shoulder, but hopefully Jair is able to come back and really put his stamp still on this season. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll be right back here tomorrow with a game day preview. But until next time, and as always, go Pack Go.